It's a tough one. This is, of course, the calm before the storm, perhaps. We have so little to go on. The man's been a vice president, politician. The responsible people say, give him a break, let's wait and see what he does. My own position, and then they say, well, he is such a chameleon, but he could go either way, so to speak. And they point out that he was historically more moderate than Reagan, who has always had a wild hair up his nose. But I personally am more of the school that I believe we do know a lot about this man. In fact, we know some things about him that are much more significant and frightening than what we knew about Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was, of course, a committed conservative who was known to have a slightly defective mind. Who
and
had
proved that was the case.
And proved it and lived up to, and had some harsh policies when he was governor of California. But Bush, this CIA directorship where he made these contacts, I worked for him. You know, I witnessed personally his supervising the CIA's covering up of illegal activity at the end of the Angola operation in early 1976. And he was actually fending off the hostile Congress. Instead of investigating and firing the perpetrators of crimes, he was fending off the FBI and the Congress on at least 3 or 4 major CIA criminal activities.
What were those activities?
Well, one was the Angolan operation, where we had broken a number of laws, much like the Iran-Contra and the Bolan kind of laws. And then we had conspired to cover up the breaking of the laws. And I mean literally, we sat around the big oak tables and discussed the law. We went down to the library and read up on the law. And then things like, I remember one session reminding the boss, you know, don't contradict yourself. Last week you said, you know, don't contradict yourself. This week, if Senator so-and-so brings up a certain issue. And this one, he just plowed right into that one. And he was just telling the Senate, you know, the Congress, I don't know, I wasn't here, but I'm sure that I just find it very difficult to believe, but we'll look into it thoroughly. If you'll just give me some slack. And he was reassuring them. And with you know, him patting him on the head, they backed off and just never got back to it. He was also doing the same thing about the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, which was being investigated in that cycle, and also the Chilean operation, the killing of, you know, the Track 1, Track 2 ouster and killing of Salvador Allende in Chile, and he was fending off an investigation of that. In the FBI stuff, the Justice Department was investigating some of the mercenaries who had been involved in the CIA's Angola program. And they were asking us specifically which ones had worked for us and in what capacities. And a young attorney showed up from the General Counsel's office responding to Bush's supervision policies, and actually went through my files and purged documents that he thought would be legally incriminating if we were subpoenaed, you know, if we were investigated. And all of that was a thorough indication of Bush's policies as I witnessed them. Beyond that, we have an incredible record that we'll get into in greater depth as we chat here now of the connections that he picked up when he was CIA director. So we have not only Noriega, but we have a dozen or dozens of Noriegas who have blackmail control of this man. Now, one would like to give anyone the benefit of the doubt and say, hopefully they're going to be more moderate, but this man even wished he to be more moderate on CIA activities, would have an uphill fight, because that establishment has got so much dirt on him. And I personally don't believe he really has any desire or instincts to withdraw from them. I think he sees a secret world that goes back to that skull and bones thing at Yale, that kind of secret elite manipulation, the Knights of Malta. I think psychologically he's just deeply committed to a view of the world where there's elite insiders who are well above the normal laws of man and God.
You look at see who's been the heads of the CIA all these years, and it's been people who've been right up at the top and intermingled, interlocked with the top people in the American power structure. It seems that that's such an important part, running an intelligence service, that the establishment people don't want any outsiders doing it.
Well, what is the implication then of having an ex-CIA director, the President of the United States? This is the first time that this has ever happened, that someone who is so deeply involved in intelligence activities is actually the President.
Well, it's a giant step towards the national security state is what it is. It's a huge victory for the national security establishment. And always remember that although it goes far beyond the CIA, but the CIA was created in the National Security Act of 1947. And the national security establishment has the CIA as one of the inner chapters, so to speak. And to have one of its directors bought into the thing totally and controlled by all of the illegal activities that he's been privy to and part of, it means just that. We've been watching and worrying, and people have been writing books for 15 years about the national security state. And this is a giant step in that direction, is what it amounts to.
So does that mean that the CIA will have much more influence in current policy than they would have otherwise? And that Bush has this mentality, the sort of conspiratorial, covert action, interventionist view of the world that these people have. How do you think that might translate practically into an increased role for the CIA? Or increased influence on Bush?
You get into some nuances or personalities, if you will. Overall, the establishment that the CIA represents is much stronger, having Bush as president. However, it's difficult to imagine the CIA being more dominant and active than it was under William Casey, for the simple reason that the man was wild, Wild Bill Casey,
right.
And he was running poorly thought out, very aggressive operations in every corner of the world. Now, Bush has decided to go with William Webster. Now, Webster is no saint.
As the head of the CIA.
As the head of the CIA, which means,
right.
yes, which means the head of the intelligence community, because the CIA director coordinates all of the intelligence in the 7 bureaucracies. Webster is no saint. It's not that, that it makes you feel reassured. In fact, he ran COINTELPRO 2 in the FBI under Reagan when they were harassing the people who were supporting or lobbying against the Contras. And but what's the most ominous thing about this man is that the establishment exonerated him totally. He was permitted by the Congress, by the establishment, by the Washington Post media, at the end of that thing, when it was exposed, of taking the idiots out, the stupidity out, the moron out, of saying, well, it's true I was director of the FBI, but I wasn't aware of any of these activities. And, the Admiral's ship sinks, and he said, well, I wasn't aware it had a hole in the side.
This sounds like a Ronald Reagan deficient management style, or simply lying.
And Bush used the same out. He sat in 17 meetings of the National Security Council in which they discussed the Iran-Contra scandal, and he says he doesn't remember their ever having talked about it.
There was also another interesting thing that he said when they asked him about Oliver North on one of the TV things. He said, well, they made 2 or 3 mistakes. The fact that it was all illegal never even fazed him. It didn't make any difference.
Back to Webster, though, it's interesting to note that 2 levels of the intelligence or national security establishment, not the community, the hard, the paid professionals, the on-duty professionals, but the community has spoken out at 2 levels. One, at the Henry Kissinger level, they've gotten together and published a paper in which they have spelled out policies that Bush should follow, which speak pretty openly of brutality towards the Third World. And then at a level below that, the Georgetown professors, where McFarlane went to work after he left the White House, where Ray Klein and others operate from, where they publish these books, the intelligence requirements for the 80s, and now they've come out for the 90s. These people, Robert Gates, the former deputy director, these people have come out with publications and statements and radio interviews and whatnot, vigorously protesting Webster as CIA director because they say he is soft on covert action. He's not aggressive enough.
Yet we know that Bush is such a believer in covert action that at least it's unlikely there'll be that much of a curtailing of covert action.
Well, we're getting into nuances. They're going to run operations for sure. It's a question of how many and how wild. And then at a certain point, you see, it's almost in the world's interest. God knows this is a perverse kind of logic, but it's almost in the world's interest to have a William Casey as opposed to William Webster, because Casey would go so far that he would self-destruct.
Right.
He was truly crazy, wild. And so these things would be exposed, and there would be a reaction. The Congress would clash with him endlessly. He would mining the harbors and lie about it. Whereas Webster is muting it with the Congress and building good relations, and by having a little bit better judgment, he may actually accomplish more in the long run, and it may be harder for us to crack it open. That are much more significant and frightening than what we knew about Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was, of course, a committed conservative who was known to have a slightly defective mind, who
and
had some
proved that that was the case.
And proved it and lived up to, and had some harsh policies when he was governor of California. But Bush could go either way, so to speak, and they point out that he was historically more moderate than Reagan, who has always had a wild hair up his nose. But I personally am more of the school that I believe we do know a lot about this man. In fact, we know some things about him. He was fending off the FBI and the Congress on at least 3 or 4 major CIA criminal activities.
What were those activities?
Well, one was the Angolan operation, where we had broken a number of laws, much like the Iran-Contra and the Bolan kind of laws. And then we had conspired. It's a tough one. This is, of course, the calm before the storm, perhaps. We have so little to go on. The man's been a vice president, politician. The responsible people say, give him a break, let's wait and see what he does. My own position, and then they say, well, he is such a chameleon, but this CIA directorship where he made these contacts, I worked for him. You know, I witnessed personally his supervising the CIA's covering up of illegal activity at the end of the Angola operation in early 1976. And he was actually fending off the hostile Congress. Instead of investigating and firing the perpetrators of crimes,